Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Lee Martin to our At Home with Literati series and in support of Gone the Hard Road, a memoir, and in conversation this evening with Sue William Silverman. Just a quick overview of webinars. If you didn't hear me as you were joining us, the chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be dropping links to purchase the book from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time, and I will ask a selection at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. Live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to you anywhere in the United States. And of course, if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, our doors are open to the public. Our hours are on our website. In lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming as it continues, as it is likely to continue for a little while here. Whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Lee Martin is the author of many novels, including The Bright Forever, a finalist for the 2006 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. He's also the author of Yours, Gene, The Mutual UFO Network, and Late One Night, among others. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in such places as Harper's, Creative Nonfiction, and The Best American Essays. Winner of the Mary McCarthy Prize in Short Fiction, the 2006 Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching, and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Ohio Arts Council. Martin teaches in the MFA program at The Ohio State University, where he is a College of Arts and Sciences distinguished professor. Speaking with him this evening, Sue William Silverman is a memoirist, poet, and teacher of writing at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. She's published several books, including Because I Remember, Terror, Father, I Remember You, Lovesick, One Woman's Journey Through Sexual Addiction, The Pat Boone Fan Club, My Life as a White Anglo-Saxon Jew, and Fearless Confessions, A Writer's Guide to Memoir. Please join me in welcoming Lee Martin and Sue William Silverman into your living rooms.
Thank you so much to Literati Bookstore. And hi, Lee. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you, Sue. That's one of the big pleasures of this evening, being able to talk with you. And I also want to thank John and everyone there at Literati for having me back and for allowing us to have this conversation tonight. Sue, you know you're one of my very favorite people in the world and a great writer. And if anyone out there has not gotten Sue's most recent book, Death and Other Convenience, How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences, you certainly need to do that.
Thank you very much for the plug, Lee. And of course, you know, you are one of my favorite people as well. This is the first time I've interviewed somebody on Zoom like this. But when you asked, you are one person I would never say no to. But I wonder if you could begin maybe by reading a short section from Gone the Hard Road, just to kind of set the mood and kind of get things kicked off.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Before I read this very brief little section, let's take care of the question of why the book's called Gone the Hard Road. If you know my work, you know that I grew up in southeastern Illinois in a very rural part of the state. Started my life on an 80-acre farm where gravel roads were the lay of the land. But those gravel roads eventually led to a paved road, which we called either the blacktop, the slab, or the hard road. And the hard road would take you into the nearest town, a town of about 1,000 people. And from there, it would take you to it actually would take you to Highway 50, which could take you all the way from Maryland to California, depending on what direction you wanted to go. So if someone were leaving home, they were said to have gone the hard road. And so that's how the book got its title. You would also know that my father lost both of his hands in a farming accident when I was barely a year old. And I was born when my mother was 45 years old. I was the only child. I was a surprise baby. I wasn't meant to come along. And I think that's about all you need to know before I read this very brief section from the opening of Gone the Hard Road. After my father was dead, my mother told me the story of the day they learned she was pregnant. They got the news in Doc Stoll's office, and the first thing my father said to the good doctor was, "Can you get rid of it?" I've written about this moment before, the moment when my father, concerned for my mother's health at that advanced age for childbearing, asked Doc Stoll if he could perform an abortion. I imagine that question hanging in the air of the office, my father waiting for Doc Stoll's response. I keep thinking about those few seconds when it was possible that Doc Stoll might say yes, and then I wouldn't exist. Wouldn't have been the son of Roy and Beulah Martin from rural Route 1, Sumner, Illinois. Wouldn't have had the 64 years I've now had to know pleasure and joy and injury and suffering. Wouldn't have had this life. I can't get the thought out of my head that there were those few seconds when it was possible that my parents would have been rid of me. But Doc Stoll said no, indeed, he couldn't do that. This baby, I imagine him saying in his gruff voice, will get born and you'll just have to deal with that. No matter how far I've come from the country kid I was, I can never forget the family we were. My kind mother who loved books, my wounded father whose intense love often got swallowed up inside his rage, and me, the only child, eager to escape my life and to immerse myself in someone else's story. Whenever we drove the hard road, I often found myself imagining all the places that lay beyond it and wondering if, given the chance, I might someday see them, might move beyond those gravel roads, might leave behind me the dust in the fields, might finally know exactly where I belonged. I fell in love with books and the life of the imagination at an early age, and because of that, the world opened to me. I can still see myself sitting beside my mother in Doc Stoll's waiting room, a Highlights for Children magazine open between us. She holds one side of it, I hold the other. Some of my fondest memories from childhood are the times we spent alone together, safely away from my father's temper. She helps me with the words I don't know. We do the puzzles, we find the hidden pictures, and we read the jokes. Sometimes she reads a story to me. Her voice is soft, and I want to listen to it forever. I like to think she believes her life has turned out exactly how she always wanted it to be. Always wanted to be a mother. Always wanted me, her son, and was glad that day when Doc Stoll said no, he couldn't get rid of it. This baby would have to be born. Read another one, I say to her when she finishes a story. And she does, my kind and patient mother. I can still hear her. All right, she says. Then she turns the page and we begin.
Thank you. I love that passage. I love how the last line, and we begin, because it sort of is also an opening then into the rest of your book. So it's, how that dovetails. I really love that. And I love the title, Gone the Hard Road. It's so evocative. And I'm wondering sort of what came first, sort of this, what is sort of the genesis? Was it the memory of this hard road? Or is it sort of the theme of wanting to write about the family, sort of the family dynamics, mainly focusing on the mother? So it's basically, did the image come first or did the theme come first?
It was actually Highlights for Children that came first.
So something else altogether.
Seriously, it really was.
Oh, fascinating.
I loved that magazine when I was a child. And I only saw it in the waiting rooms of doctors' offices and dentist offices. And so the memory of my mother reading to me from the magazine was the first thing that brought me to the page. And then I quickly realized that I was writing a memoir that was going to feature my mother, unlike my previous work, which had focused so much upon my father and our relationship. And so then it became a matter of the title, what I was going to call this. I couldn't call it Highlights for Children, obviously.
Right. That was taken.
Yeah, that was taken. And so I remembered that phrase, "Gone the hard road." And so much of the book is about the life my mother sort of invited me to build for myself, which was a life that would take me away from that place and from her, essentially. And then that phrase, "gone the hard road," became not just a literal detail in the writing, but it became a metaphor, right?
Totally.
For escape, yeah.
To me, it's also kind of a metaphor for the family itself that's sort of living this hard road.
Right,
You
right.
know, the family struggle. So it works on many metaphorical levels.
Yeah, I got lucky with that.
Yeah, you did.
But you're right. It does speak to another phrase I remember using in that place and time was you've got a hard row to hoe.
Exactly.
And so it kind of works in that way too.
Exactly. Most of us who write creative nonfiction kind of have a core story, something that's, very central to our lives that at least so that some mention of it appears or reappears in maybe almost everything we write. And for you, though, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like that it's the narrator's father's accident when he loses both of his hands in a farming accident. And over the course of several nonfiction books, I wonder if you, as author and narrator, have sort of come to understand this kind of core event differently or sort of in different manifestations.
That's a really great question, Sue. First of all, you're right. That's the core event of my entire life, because not only did he change drastically because of the accident, the anger that he brought into our home had a tremendous effect upon my mother and upon me. But writing about it, I can't remember who said this. Maybe somebody out there knows, maybe you know, Sue, maybe it was Flaubert, I can't remember. But some writer said that if you're lucky, you figure out early on what your obsessions are and you spend your life writing about them. Well, I figured out mine.
Yeah.
Yeah. But writing about that accident, even in this book, when it's way on the periphery of this
Yes.
book, but it's there. Its influence is there, and I keep writing about it from different vantage points, different perspectives. For example, in "Gone the Hard Road," I write about it from the perspective of my grandmother, my father's mother, and what that must have been like for her to see her son named in that way and to see the way he changed. And I keep writing about it from different perspectives, trying to understand it in a different way, right?
Exactly. Yeah. On page 33 is this quote, all my life, I've tried to rescue those damaged hands so I might reconstruct them, carry them to him. First of all, that's just an absolutely heartbreaking line. It's just so moving. And I wondered, have you rescued his hands through writing, or does that sort of remain too elusive?
Well, when I wrote my first memoir, a book called From Our House, which was directly about my father's accident and the difficult relationship we had, I remember getting to the end of the first draft of that book and just weeping, because I had sort of faced all the demons, right? And I tried to, and what I had actually done was I had understood things from his perspective better. And so, I was sure that he lived a life of regret, of not turning off the power takeoff to the tractor, which would have stopped the rollers from turning on the corn picker, and then everything would have been fine. So it's like I'm really aware of this moment of before and after, this moment where our lives kind of separated into what they were before the accident and what they were after the accident. I'm not sure I'll ever redeem his mistake for him. And I don't think that's actually my goal. I think my goal is just to understand better my family. And I think I've done that. This may be the very last thing I write about my family, to tell
Oh,
you.
no. There's always more. But yeah.
There are only so many events that one can recall, right?
Right. So in, a memoirist writes from sort of two different perspectives, or, personal essay, memoir, sort of the person that they were back then, when the events happen, and the person that you are now, or we are now. And I think that in Gone the Hard Road, you blend these together really beautifully. And so what I wonder is, when you begin like the first draft, do you feel that you're writing primarily from one perspective or the other? Or do you have that kind of double vision right from the start?
Well, in this book, I think you could tell from the passage I read, I was really focused on sort of the child's perspective, even though it's clear that it's me in the here and now, kind of looking back. But then, I'm trying to imagine what that moment was like in the doctor's office. And so to do that, I sort of have to just pay really close attention to the details that I imagine being relevant to the conversation with the doctor. And so then I move from that into a more modulated voice, I would say, between the adult in the here and now and the child who was a participant in the events that I'm dramatizing. I think when I write memoir, I'm always, my first obligation is to tell a compelling story. My second obligation is to make sense of that story. And so then, you got the reflective voice, you've got the adult sort of interrogating experience and seeing what they can make of it. I use imagination a lot, just because so much of my family history happened outside my knowing. And so I'm sort of forced to try to imagine certain things. And of course, in the act of imagining those things, Sue, in memoir, we obviously reveal more about ourselves than we do about the people we're trying to imagine.
Right. And to me, that's why when we imagine scenes, it's not like lying. I know some students get nervous about imagining things. And I try to convey, well, no, you're not lying, because what's in your imagination, your head is revealing you.
That's right. And we can do whatever we want to, as long as we're honest with the reader that we are imagining. And I like for there to be a reason for the imagining. As I said in my case, because there was so much that I wasn't privy to. And my family didn't talk about these things. My mother didn't tell me that story about what my father said about can you get rid of it until he was dead. And I was stunned by how nonchalant she was in the telling of the story. That was the thing that caught me up most of all, was the fact that my mom told me this story and seemed to have no awareness of what that might do to me hearing it.
Right. It's like, oh, by the way.
Yeah. By the way, you almost didn't exist.
I know. That's just, there's certain things like when in your books that just make me want, that's one that make me just sort of pause and say, wait, just stop a minute. Wait, Lee's mom, I have to tell you this. And the others, when with the father, I just like, every time I read about his accident, I want to like, just turn that switch off. It's just like, oh, wait, I want to do that. It's just.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I know.
Absolutely. That's the moment I wish I could change for him.
I know.
But then I wouldn't have anything to write about.
Yeah, see, that's right. I know. I know. Um, so there are a number of dynamics in this book that I find really fascinating. I mean, you've got the mother and the father, and then you have the rural and suburban. You have anger and tolerance. You sort of intellectual work versus kind of physical work. And I wonder if you had these dualities in mind when you started Gone the Hard Road, or kind of did you discover them kind of in the process of writing, or maybe some of both?
I think it's primarily that I discovered them in the process of writing. Um, it's not so much that, I never set out when I write to take on anything large. I start with the really small things like highlights for children magazines and gravel roads and the memory of the way rain smelled when it was moving toward us and the grasshoppers leaping in the wheat fields and banging up against my legs. I start in that really visceral concrete world, and then I let that build the larger concerns of the work I'm doing.
And sort of to follow up on that, I mean, you sort of have kind of answered this, but I'd just like to take it a step further. On page 25, and you need to open your book to page 25, you describe a photo of your father when he was a little boy. And first, I'd love it if you could just read the paragraph that starts, that was my father. Do you see that paragraph?
I think our pagination is different, Sue,
Oh,
because
no.
I think you may have an ARC.
I do. Oh, dear. Can I read it for you then?
Please do.
All right. Sorry. Okay. Pretend I'm Lee Martin, everybody. So this is the paragraph. And then I would like to ask you a question about it. That was my father, volatile and explosive. I was always on guard for the next person, the next thing that would set him off. He filled our house with rage. And now I wonder whether, little by little, my grandmother forgot the sweet boy he'd been, the one I see now in an old photograph, holding a bit of feathery fluff in his dimpled hands as he smiles at the camera. I mean, that's just a heartbreaking and just beautiful passage. And I felt like that this photo is a kind of portal that the narrator uses to discover the love that he does feel toward his father, even though, despite the father's anger. So I wonder, I mean, you've already mentioned this a little bit, but if you could talk a bit more about this use of objects or things that help us as writers kind of enter the internal emotional place, kind of what T.S. Eliot calls the objective correlative.
Right. Sure. And by the way, I do have the same page as you. I just want to read that passage. No, actually, I did look down. I see it now. Well, that photograph and photographs in general, I think, work this way. They are a portal into the past. And then I'm tempted to say that from that past, we find the portal into the present and into the future. So when I look at that photograph of my father as a small boy, and he's holding this fluff of feathery fluff in his hands, and I can see the dimples on the back of his hands. Well, first of all, I'm fascinated with his hands.
Yeah. I'm
absolutely fascinated with any photograph, and I think I only have a handful that show his hands. I'm always fascinated with that. But to think of him as that child in that state of innocence really makes me feel for him the direction his life took that day in the cornfield. And so it opens up another dimension of his character that might be easy to overlook, given the hurtful nature of our relationship until we reconciled later in my early adult years. I might have overlooked that aspect of his character if not for that photograph. Um, when I wrote From Our House, I told the story that my grandmother had told me of my father as a boy coming home late from school because an older boy had thrown his cap up on the schoolhouse roof, and he thought he'd be in trouble if he went home without his cap. And I actually received a letter after that book was published from the woman who had been his teacher, who had remembered that day. And because back then, girls started teaching when they were like 16 years old, and in these little 2 one-room schoolhouses.
Right. Yeah.
So she writes me this letter and she says, I remember that day, and I remember your father, and what a sweet boy he was. And it's again another example of sort of a document that becomes a portal into my consideration of my father. And again, I would have missed that, or I might have missed that, if not for that document, that letter.
Exactly. That's just such a, oh God, it's such a moving story.
She was very old at the time she wrote. She was in her late 90s, I think.
Wow.
Um,
But what a gift that she did write and that you
yeah,
have
it really
that.
was. It really was.
So Wordsworth wrote, quote, "The child is father of the man." And it seems to me that there are 3 people in the adult Lee Martin that the adult Lee Martin learns from in Gone the Hard Road. There's the mother, there's the father, and then there's the young Lee himself. So having finished this book, is there a particular lesson you discovered your young self could teach you apart from your parents?
Well, I think I understand your question. I'll start talking and you tell me if I'm on a different path. But I mean, one of the lessons that I learned from the writing of the book was just how unconditional and limitless my mother's love for me was. I mean, that was part of the reason I wanted to write this book about her. I wanted to try to figure out who she was in that marriage to my father, and how she was able to maintain her faith that everything would be all right for our family, even though all the indications were it would not be. And I, as a teenager, stretched her patience tremendously from my own misbehavior when I was in high school. And yet there she always was, sort of ready to support me, encourage me, provide things for me like children's book clubs that she enrolled me in, and public libraries she introduced me to, and boxes of books she would buy at auctions and bring to me, some of which I still have on my bookshelves. And so, I think the thing I learned was, and this is the thing I hope I carry with me to this day, I learned that that when you truly love your child, you forgive them so much. And without my mother and without her love, I don't think I would have the life I have now.
Yeah, that definitely comes across in the book. I mean, and it's just such a beautiful, I think, part of the book. And I guess I also wonder that, say, if as you now today or writing the book, think back on who you were as a child. I mean, did that young Lee also, like, what lessons do you think you learned from the young Lee?
Oh, well, well, I had this year in high school that I like to call my lost year, where I was all about rebellion and getting into trouble, et cetera, et cetera. And at the time, I was getting into trouble for shoplifting and such such acts of that kind. I always believed I was better than that. So I think I probably picked that up from my mother. But maybe it was something that was innate, right? That I felt that I was a good person, but I was on a terrible road. I was going the wrong direction, and I finally realized that, and tried to, as they say in my neck of the woods, straighten up and fly right. And I eventually did, and everything turned out okay. But I guess I learned from the young Lee that, well, one thing I learned was I probably wasn't meant for that small town rural life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I mean, the narrator in this book is very hard on himself, I feel. Like he chastises himself sort of from his viewpoint, for fighting with his father or sort of emotionally upsetting his mother. And as a reader, I felt really sad for this younger self, the little Lee, who felt he was a disappointment to his parents, and especially his mother. And I wonder if the older narrator self has forgiven himself. And is this sort of a reason, maybe even for writing the book, maybe to forgive himself or yourself, but maybe also to find a kind of grace for the whole family?
Yeah, Sue, I think I've forgiven myself for the indiscretions of youth. We were all young once, and we all did things that we weren't particularly proud of. I'm not sure, you've really got me thinking about this now. I'm not sure I've ever completely forgiven myself for leaving my mother when I went off to the MFA program at the University of Arkansas. My father had died 2 weeks before. My mother, she didn't have any other children to take care of her. She didn't even drive. She had a driver's license before we moved to the suburbs of Chicago, but she just let it lapse up there, and she never got a license again when we moved back downstate. So she relied on my father for everything, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And so to leave her alone, which is the moment I describe at the very end of the book, it took me a long time to be able to read that last part of the book without choking up, because it's a moment that really haunts me to this day, leaving my mother behind. But your thought about finding grace for the family, yes, I do think that's there, and I think that's something that surfaces through the writing of the book. That attempt to find moments of grace for the family.
Yeah, I mean, I think so as well, and I think that writing about it can help us. Even if we don't forgive ourselves, at least understand it better and understand our kind of our own motivations and stuff. And of course, the narrator's mother wants him to go.
Yeah,
really.
she did want me to go, and that was a tremendous gift to me.
Yeah.
At this time of sort of trauma for our family with the death of my father, for my mother to be able to say, "You should go," that was a real gift to me. It was like it was probably her final gift to me.
Yeah, that's so moving. On page 20, the narrator discovers irony for the first time over his experience with that kite, like that wasn't actually a kite. And I love that section. And it intrigues me as well, because I'd love to ask you sort of how you see the difference between irony in real life versus irony, say, that we use in writing, kind of narrative irony. I mean, irony I know it's a really big topic, but I have to say that it's the thing that I, as a writer, most struggled with when I started to write. Like I totally understood irony in real life. Like I get what irony means. But when I was trying to, like everybody said, well, you have to use irony. I had no idea what my faculty advisors were talking about. Like, what is that when you're right? And I just wondered that we probably have some writers in the audience. If maybe you could talk a little bit about the use of irony.
Sure, absolutely. I struggled with it too, Sue.
Oh, good. I feel better.
I don't know if it's something about Midwestern writers or not, but we're so straightforward. We kind of miss the ironic slant sometimes. So in this case, the scene you're talking about, this is when I was a very young child, and my parents had gone to a grade school basketball game at the school where my mother taught, and I wasn't able to go because I had a cold. But I told them that I wanted them to bring me a kite. Now, I had been to basketball games there, and I had seen these organizations selling these, they were actually sort of homemade styrofoam boats that would float in the bath or whatever, et cetera. And I don't know why, but for some reason, I thought they were called kites. And so I asked my mother to bring me a kite. And so she comes home and she has a real kite, the kind that you fly in the sky. It's a honeymooner's kite with Jackie Gleason's face in the moon, right? And I'm really upset because, as I say, I wanted a kite. This is a kite, my mother said. But I wanted a kite, I said, a real kite. My mother said they're mystified. My father, irritated because I was talking in italics and had obviously taken leave of my senses, said he could give me something to cry about, something real to cry about, if that's what I wanted. And so here's, to me, the key to doing a scene like that. It's the fact that when you're the child, you don't know what irony is, right? But as the adult, you know exactly what irony is. And yet you don't let the reader know that you know what irony is. And in that way, the reader participates in sort of the incongruity and the humor of the scene, because they know exactly why it's ironic. But I don't acknowledge that. I just let the scene play out.
Right. I love that whole passage. So Tolstoy famously wrote, "Happy families are all alike, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." And of course, that's a big generalization, but Gone the Hard Road counts both and unhappiness in the home in which you grew up. And I just wondered, which one do you think is harder to write about? Kind of the happy moments or the unhappy moments?
That's a really good question. I think our inclination as memoirists is to feature the unhappy moments, because wounds usually bring us to the page. We suffer in some way and we want to try to make sense of that. So we sort of line out the scenes that were part of the unhappy aspects. But I do think that if we limit ourselves to those, then we do a disservice not only to our own experience, but also to our readers. Because within all of the unhappy moments in my own family, there were moments of great happiness and great closeness with both my father and my mother. I mean, one of my fondest memories is Sunday afternoons lying on the couch with my father listening to St. Louis Cardinals baseball games. And so if I don't write those moments, then I haven't really told the story of my family. I've told a one-dimensional, one-sided story of my family. So it's probably a little easier to write the unhappy moments, but it's just as rewarding to write the happy moments.
Yeah, and to show that balance and everything.
Yeah.
And because the unhappy moments are more are deeper when you show the happy moments, and sort of vice versa.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm going to ask you kind of a personal question, which you can refuse to answer if you want. But when you're talking to me, you're going there.
That's good.
So I've always felt that if I came from one of Tolstoy's so-called happy families, that I would not have been a writer. And so I wonder if that might be true for you. And if so, which would you have preferred, like a happy family back then or the life you have now as a writer?
Well, I love the life I have as a writer. I absolutely love it. And I've been so blessed and fortunate to have it. And I agree with you that if it hadn't been for the unhappiness in my family, I may not have become a writer. But I do think that because my father lost his hands and I was at such a young age, I was immediately taken out of my home and put in the home of my aunt and uncle while my father was in the hospital, etc. And my aunt told me years later that she would take me down to the hospital around noon, and my mother would come down to the waiting room and try to hold me. And I wouldn't let her hold me. I would cling to my aunt. And so the reason I tell this story is I think at that very moment, I was sort of becoming the person a writer has to be, the person who has to observe very, very closely to figure out what's going on around them, to try, and then as I grew older, to try to avoid my father's anger, to be very alert to what was happening around me. So yeah, I think all the unhappiness certainly contributed to the fact that I became a writer.
Yeah, it's so interesting though, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
the path is just chosen so early, even though we don't know it.
Yeah. But then I was also lucky in the fact that my mother was such a lover of books, and my father was a great oral storyteller. I mean, he would sit with other men and tell stories, and I would just listen. And so I learned a lot about how to structure a story just from listening to these guys tell their own stories. So it's
Yeah.
kind of a combination of language being all around me, and then the event that caused me to be really observant.
Yeah. I'm thinking maybe we should just maybe pause for a second and see if there are questions from the audience. John, hi.
There,
Wait, you're muted
I
there.
hit my
Hi.
space bar. There are no questions at the moment, but I would encourage viewers, if they have any questions for Dee, to submit them using the Q&A feature that's available to them on the toolbar of their webinar. But Sue, I'll turn it back over to you for any additional questions.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, we'll see if somebody jumps in with any questions. Wonder if you had the same pagination. The last paragraph on page 45 is actually the last section of the section called bachelors. I wonder if you could sort of set that up and then read it, and then I have a question for you.
You say it's on page 45?
Yes. Oh, wait. It's the end of the section bachelors. Maybe
that's 42 perhaps.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's all right. What's the paragraph begin with?
Yeah. So we were bachelors that summer.
We were bachelors that summer. This was the summer that my mother was finishing her bachelor's degree at Eastern Illinois University. And I lived alone with my father on the farm, and she would come home on the weekends. We were bachelors that summer. We had each other just the way Dewey and Grace did, just the way my parents did. I was just beginning to learn what they already knew, all the ways to reinvent ourselves when trouble comes. When we find out, we'll do anything to keep ourselves from being alone. Yeah.
I mean, that's a beautiful paragraph. And I wonder if this is also why we write, to sort of so we aren't alone.
Yeah, that's a really good thought, Sue. I never meant to write memoir. I'm an accidental memoirist. I was a fiction writer, and my first tenure track teaching position, they assigned me a graduate workshop in creative nonfiction. And I thought, well, I better try to write some of it. If I'm going to teach, I better write some of it. And I wrote a little essay called From Our House, which was the very first time I wrote directly about my father's accident. And that spun into the first book length memoir I wrote. But I do think that part of the reason I love writing creative nonfiction so much is because it forces me to claim my own experience, to announce it to others. And in the process, it makes me feel less alone. And I get the same experience when I read your work or the work of a number of other memoirists whom I admire. Even though our experiences are completely different, there's something about the examination and the interrogation and the discovery that connects on an emotional level with me. And reading your books and other people's books makes me feel less alone.
Yeah, me too. And it's so funny because when I read that, I thought, I mean, my immediate thought was, oh, and that's also about writing, I felt like. So I wanted to ask you about that. And you mentioned starting out as a fiction writer. And of course, you were nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for your novel, The Bright Forever, which, by the way, everybody, is a brilliant novel. For me, I've been spectacularly unsuccessful as a fiction writer. So I'm curious, like, how do you approach writing fiction differently from creative nonfiction? Like, do you prepare for writing in one genre or the other differently? And I guess by that, I mean both in your psychic, emotional approach, but also kind of in the nuts and bolts way that you might go around putting words on the page.
Well, first of all, Sue, I failed spectacularly as a poet. So we have our own genres in which we
If we spectacularly fail.
right. Writing memoirs in some ways much easier than writing fiction, because the facts of your life have already dictated the narrative arc that you're going to follow. When you write fiction, I anyway, have to make myself very, very curious about characters and their situations, to the point that I'm willing to follow them as I write to see what might happen next. So in other words, I don't have a narrative arc when I write a novel. I'm creating it as I go along, and to prepare to do that, I have to be open to curiosity. Who are these people? What have they done? How has it caused trouble for them? What will they do to try to get out of the trouble? And that's the way I write fiction. I never know what's going to happen when I write fiction. I let the details create what's going to happen. But when I write memoir, of course, I know what literally happened. And so I have to prepare myself for writing memoir by being willing to be more reflective, to interrogate experience, to think out loud on the page.
Yeah, I mean, because also in creative nonfiction, like, I might remember the facts of what happened, but I sort of don't know what's going to happen next, like emotionally, like how one emotion is going to sort of prompt the next emotion, that kind of thing.
True, yeah.
We do have a question from the audience, and so this might be our first and potentially our last question, time permitting, but if you do have questions, you can feel free to submit them. Marty writes, "Hi, Lee and Sue. Lee, oops, I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Hi, Lee and Sue. Lee, I'm curious about your sequence of writing the horizontal versus vertical plot."
We're frozen up for a second.
Oh, yeah, no worries there. Do you write them both at the same time, or do you write the story first and then incorporate your reflective voice later?
Thanks for that question, Marty. By the horizontal, I assume you're meaning the narrative line that's moving chronologically through time. And by the vertical, I assume you mean going down into experience and into character and into my own thinking and feeling about experience. And for me, it's always the horizontal, the narrative that invites me to pause and to go down into that experience to sort of find out my complexity of emotion and intellectual response to the horizontal moment that I'm describing. So the more I've written creative nonfiction, I think the better able I've been to sort of blend the two as I'm going along. So it's not a matter of doing one first and then doing the other. It's a matter of just letting the narrative invite the reflective moments and the thinking out loud on the page.
Yeah, so ultimately it's kind of a twining together of the two, sort of rippling throughout the narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for the question, Marty.
Well, we have reached the top of the hour. Lee Martin, Sue William Silverman, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati. You can purchase Gone the Hard Road from Literati. There's a link in the chat. Also, if you're watching us later on YouTube, there's links in the description below. You can order from Literati as well. Sue William Silverman's latest, How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences. Once again, there's a link in the chat and a link in the description if you're watching us on YouTube. But Sue and Lee, thank you so much for joining us on Zoom tonight, and we hope we can have you in the store for round 2 sometime in the not too distant future. But until then, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Lee.
Oh, Sue, thank you.
Take care, all.
Bye.